Hey everyone, this is James from TDB here, bringing you another Inbetweenisode. Today, I am going to be doing another comparison episode, so we're going to get right into that in just a moment. But first, really quickly, wanted to describe what we are doing. We're going to be comparing two very famous, very well-known, perhaps the most well-known 20-year-old factory recipes from the two biggest factories. So, of course, on one side of the corner, we will be talking about the 2005 7542 Dayi, the 504, and then on the other side, we'll be talking about the 2005 Thick Paper T8653. I have the January batch. I don't know if it matters so much between January and February, but those are kind of the two ones we're going to be talking about. The Thick Paper 8653 is one of my regular brews, so one that passes the speed test. The 504 7542 is from a sample from a blind taste from TV like a year or two ago, or a couple of years at this point. So yeah, these are kind of the two most classic recipes from the two biggest factories. And also, if you are not familiar with kind of reading the numbers of these, the third number here, so 8653, the 5 in that case, 7542, the 4 in that case, should represent the leaf grade, so that one means we're talking about leaf grades in terms of size. So 4 and 5, pretty close together too. So in that sense, this comparison makes a little bit more sense, I think, than like 8653 versus 8582. So yeah, 20 years here, and I do want to mention too that in general, I think I am more of a Dayi guy than a showdown guy. But this fight, I think, is a little bit rigged towards the showdown front, mainly because I think the Thick Paper 8653 is a really, it's kind of the cream of the crop of the batches that showdown made during this year, and they made quite a few. And the ones later in the year, especially the ones that are non-iron and kind of later in the year, are just not that good, in my opinion. So the Thick Paper, we're kind of picking and choosing our fighters here. Whereas the 504 7542, I did a comparison of 504 versus 502. 502 is not even like necessarily the most famous batch. That'd definitely be 501, which gets a really high price, by the way. That there was a big difference in quality, I think, between the 502 and the 504. So it's not totally fair, but we're going to do it anyways because it's my belief that these imperfect comparisons are still useful and interesting, just provided you kind of take the right takeaways from them. I think the wrong takeaway, if, for instance, the 8653 comes out shining here, is that 8653 is automatically better than 7542 all the time. I don't believe that, no matter what the results are in this thing. But, we'll take the results and we'll see what happens. So yeah, excited to get into it. So yeah, let's drink both of these teas. All right, so let's do it. So I have already rinsed both teas twice and brewed them once. Idea just being to get into kind of the core steeps sooner. And again, I am brewing these teas to taste good rather than kind of some standardized brewing where I'm going to do 30 seconds for each or something like that. Yeah, that's just my preference. I want to enjoy my tea as well. So I'm brewing them for my own enjoyment. Yes. So I brought both of these teas over at kind of around the same time. The showdown tea is from MXT, kind of a well-known Taobao store that sells a lot of showdown. And the 7542 was a tasting panel kind of around the same period. Maybe it was a year later or a year earlier. I'm not totally sure. Anyways, this is the showdown tea on my right, so let's do that. So we are talking about the Southern Chinese storage versus kind of Taiwanese storage as well. But, might be roughly comparable. We'll see. Okay. So keeping those steeps relatively short. Take a quick smell. Yep, smells like the tea I've been brewing. Woody, pine, menthol. Very standard profile. And I've had this tea a lot in the past month or so. And so, yeah, it's definitely one that I'm pretty fond of. And as you might be able to tell, I have drank through a fair bit of a cake. One tip of advice I do have to people if they're brewing it, don't be afraid to just toss out some of the dust. I do see a lot of people complaining about inconsistent sessions with something like Love Forever. I have actually started to get pretty consistent sessions, and it's more or less just being okay with a little bit of tea waste, dumping dust. If you're brewing like 50% dust, the tea is just, you're not setting the tea up well for kind of success there. So that's just kind of a small tip, especially when it comes to things like heavily compressed teas like most of these factory teas, but even more so with like the iron cakes like this one. Okay, so yeah, let's get to these teas. Again, Dayi on the left, right here pouring, and shagwan on the right. As you might expect, the Dayi has unfurled just a little bit faster. It also has a little bit of a darker color there. So cheers. Let's start with a shagwan. Medium body, a little oily. Definitely, yeah, kind of tastes exactly like I expect. The menthol, the pine. Very, very, very woody. No fruit. Pretty consistent theme in this recipe for me. I don't get very many fruity notes at all. Definitely does let you know it's a little bit of ripe pu'erh rather, as it hits at some astringency and some resin. Sort of tea that is good now, and definitely I'm okay drinking it clearly, but I think we'll continue to improve. And here we go, to the Dayi tea. I would say this is actually a step thicker. It's also pretty woody. Let's see, I mean, I feel like in terms of the recipes for Dayi 7542, 8582, 7542 veers a little bit more towards fruit flavors than the 8582, which for me at least is more woody. Okay, yeah, we're getting some fruit flavors too, some sweetness. It's definitely punchy. I would say the bitterness and the sharpness is a little bit more present in this than the shagwan tea. Yeah, punchy for sure. I would say this is definitely a step punchier than the shagwan. It does have some nice stuff going on. Definitely a full taste. In fact, I'd say that's one thing that impresses it. I think the shagwan compared to this might seem just a little bit hollow. Yeah, and you know, when we do these comparisons, the differences of these teas is really going to be emphasized. I know that's something I say every time, but again, I don't know if people are watching every comparison and looking at my notes like in super meticulous fashion or whatever. So yeah, let's get to the steep number 3 here. I am noticing that this Dayi tea, I've had the shagwan so much that I feel pretty comfortable with the tea. The aftertaste is very nice, kind of like coating the mouth and whatnot. It definitely feels like a very Boolong-y type tea, which is, you know, what 7542 kind of more or less is, a Munghai County blend with a lot of that kind of punchy material that should come with kind of a nice aftertaste too. Okay, so yeah, let's do this. I do actually have a cake of 7542 504, which I did not realize until a couple months ago. I bought it years ago. I think it was like some sort of a tong split that I got tagged onto, probably because they needed someone to take another cake. I think I got it for a very good price, but it will make these comparisons to continue to be very doable. Nice aroma off this, woody fruit, yeah, kind of a combination of those two. It's probably like 2-to-1 wood to fruit, but compared to the shagwan, it tastes fruity because the shagwan has basically none of that kind of like fruit sweetness to it. Okay, and also noting that we are getting a little bit of a darker color from the Dayi currently. The extraction of these is just going to be a little bit variable because we are working with an iron cake for the shagwan. So trying to lean on it just a little bit more in order to kind of maximize those brews. But, you know, brewing is subject to human error and just how I am doing it. So nice aroma. Yeah. Okay. Believe it or not, this is definitely a comparison I have been looking forward to doing just because 20-year-old factory tea, I mean, it's not like the ideal time. There's definitely like time for these teas to continue to age and evolve, but they're not bad. I mean, I honestly don't mind drinking either of these teas right now. Cheers. Kind of a continuation of that flavor profile. It's a little bit thinner up front. In fact, if I remember right, the 502 scored quite a bit better than this just in terms of like fullness. And so I do get a little bit of that thinness coming here. We'll see how it compares with the shogwan. I feel like the first steep in two of this were pretty impressive, but I wonder if it's a tea that peaks pretty early. Overall, pretty solid still. It's just not quite as dense as it was on steep 1 or 2. Okay, so let's go over to Mr. Iron Cake 8653. Cheers. Yeah, it's the aftertaste is hitting. It's just like a nice fruit and wood. If you wanted to be like a little bit more detailed in your comparison, probably would take your time a little bit more, spend some time, take some notes on the aftertaste and whatnot. But I'm recording a video, so time is important. I'm already kind of I could definitely see people getting bored with some of these videos too, so I want to keep these things going at a decent pace. Cheers. On one hand, it's a little thinner. On the other hand, it's more oily, and that's something I'm enjoying. I would say the first 2 steeps, I definitely enjoyed the Dayi a bit more than the shogwan, but the Dayi in particular has like those bones that feel like they're meant to age a little longer. Thick paper is getting into a nice space to drink, though. So in terms of reaching the potential, the Dayi has a little bit more kind of guts to it. Okay, let's do one more. This might be the last one. We'll see. Okay, so usually I will swap the order each time. We just had that water boiled, so we're gonna just leave it. The cumulative effect is me having just kind of a nice sweetness coating over my mouth. Yeah, if I were to knock the shogwan at all, it's just that the body is not super thick. But that being said, it does feel like it's this session, as well as the one with the Dayi 8653, have kind of convinced me that it's in a pretty decent space to drink. I would say compared to the Dayi here, the initial taste is definitely not as bitter as the Dayi is right now. What does that tell you exactly? Well, I mean, I think in comparison, the Dayi seemed even sweeter than this. So doing this comparison, this seems sweeter. So I guess in terms of sweetness, in terms of comparisons I've done recently, the Dayi is maybe the least sweet up front, not disregarding the aftertaste. This is kind of in the middle, and then the Dayi is like a little bit sweeter. That one's even more hollow, I would definitely say, than this tea. So that's definitely a flaw to look out for. I think the Dayi in general has fairly nice density. Well, I am a little concerned. It does seem to be dropping off a little bit, and that was definitely the case when I did the comparison episode of 502 versus 504. The kind of differences in quality in the 502 and 504 became even more present the further I steeped them out. Cheers. Still got a nice thick body, fruity, woody, pretty simple. In fact, I'd say the shogwan blend's a little more complex, but I don't necessarily rate complexity as a huge positive trait. It's more neutral in my book. Yeah, the fruity notes coming out just a little bit here. Yeah, bitter, fruit, wood. Pretty nice, yeah. I want to go one more. Let's do it. And let's make sure I have enough water. Barely, okay. We only have enough for one more steep anyways. I will certainly keep drinking these teas. If I were to drink for maximum enjoyment, I would definitely do one session and then the next. Things like aftertaste and whatnot are really going to get pretty muddled when you do this side by side. But it is interesting. In some ways, I think this kind of shows you that Dayi in general is probably a fair bit better than shogwan. The fact that like kind of the cream of the crop 8653 from that year is just kind of holding its own versus like definitely not the top tier 7542 from that year. I mean, it only shows you specifically this snapshot here. That's not to say later, but I think in general Dayi has a reputation of being a little bit more premium than shogwan. Okay, so yeah, we start with the Dayi in this case. I'll let these go a little bit longer than the last time. So yeah, like if you were to pick the best 7542 from that year, 501 versus this shotgun, I kind of suspect that the 501 will blow the socks off of this, just because, you know, it has a lot of good reviews. I don't know if I've ever had the 501 or, yeah, I'd have to think about that. It's not one I've had recently, at the very least. It always becomes very tricky to get yourself to buy a tea when you remember when it was cheaper, and it was something you could have bought when it was cheaper. Like, for me at least, the 501, it was like, oh, that's $100 a cake or something, or $80 a cake back in like 2015 or whatever. Seems kind of expensive for what it is, and then it blossoms up to like 600, 700. I don't know what it is now. I think it went back down to 300 or 400, but those are basically Dayi prices, where they can go up and they can also go down. It's certainly one of those that has fluctuated quite a bit over the time, in a way that shotgun hasn't. In the same way, this Iron T8653 is very easy to acquire. You can find quite a few sources from it. You can find kind of the January batch if you want to pay a bit more from Teas We Like. I think it's about $145 there, but you can definitely find it around Taobao and whatnot for quite a bit less than that too. Okay, so yeah, a little bit longer steeps for both of these guys. Definitely pretty enjoyable to use, both of them, I would say. 7542 for me is a recipe that I feel like it feels like you're wasting a little bit of potential to have it too soon. So this is like probably one where I would be more confident being like, yeah, 7542, I'd probably age that a bit. Whereas the shotgun sort of in between, sort of like the 8582, where I'm okay drinking it at this kind of age range. You could definitely improve a little bit, but it's really not bad in terms of smoothness and whatnot. Okay, so yeah, getting more or less the same aromas here. Aroma pungency is pretty similar. Maybe the Dayi is a little bit more aromatic. And it just goes to show you, the 504 was blown out by the 502 in a past episode. But in this episode, it's, you know, more or less kind of similar grades of tea here. Cheers. Okay, now it's starting to fall a little bit. It's thinner, but because I brewed it so long, it's also more stringent. So you're kind of getting the worst of both worlds there. Yeah, so, I mean, I think this 7542 falls off a little fast for my taste. It's otherwise kind of a solid tea. This steep is not bad, but I can feel like we're just kind of on the edge of the cliff, ready to fall. Okay. Keeping in mind as well that didn't have to rinse it twice too, so it's not like it's dying after a steep or two. Cheers. Now we're at the point where the shotgun is maybe starting to get a little bit thicker. The shotgun doesn't have super longevity, but it has decent ones. You can definitely get a few more solid steeps out of it as well. A little more stringent because of that increased steep time, but not overwhelmingly so. And kind of continuing that very consistent pine wood taste. So yeah, definitely one that I enjoy quite a bit. I'd rate these teas very close together. I think I gave the Shotgun 8653 something like a 7.2. That sounds about right. I've changed my rating scale recently to try to allow a little bit more of a spectrum, something to keep in mind. I think I'd rate this tea more or less exactly the same as that one. Maybe a little more challenging to enjoy, but I think it kind of depends on your temperament and if you like kind of the very, very punchy teas. I think this is a tea that I would probably still lean towards storing for a bit longer before it's kind of like captured enough of its potential to really drink. But, you know, your mileage may vary. All right, thank you all for tuning in. I'll see y'all next time. Cheers.